Hi, my name is Chun from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and today I want to talk about my poster, Storytelling in Astronomy. Now, stories get a bad rap in science just because of this phrase that many of us have always heard, that the plural of anecdote is not data, which means that we shouldn't use stories in science just because one sample story may not reflect reality. But communicating story turns out to be extremely effective. Stories tend to be very engaging, they tend to be memorable, and if we think about astronomy, stories are probably how people learned astronomy for many thousands of years. So where do people nowadays get their science stories? Well, they probably don't get it, very few of them get it from museums or attending planetarium shows and even listening to an astronomer talk. Most of the time, they get it from the media. And the mass media really use stories to a large extent to reach their audiences. And so we are not competing very well with the other media if our science communication tools are not as effective as their storytelling tools. Now, there is research to show the effectiveness of storytelling. So, for instance, stories tend to be easier to read. They take less time to read than information told in non-story form. And stories are also more effective at getting people to remember or to recall information. So the amount of time that it takes to read to lead to a recall for a certain amount of information here is less when it's done in narrative form. We can also show that facts are also more easily recalled if they were inserted at a causal location in the story. And what that means is if you put them at a narrative point, that's important for later on in the narrative. So people tend to remember the facts located at those causal points than at non-causal points. And then also, if you put storytellers and also people listening to stories in fMRI machines, you can do brain scans and show that the same parts of their brains are lit up when in both the storyteller and the story listener. So we're literally seeing neural patterns that are transplanted from one brain to another via oral storytelling. fMRI studies have also been used for people watching videos, and they show that people react to and look at the same things in a well-told story. And also extremely engaging stories lead to more highly correlated brain patterns. So in one case, a suspenseful Alfred Hitchcock movie on the far left, and in the other case on the far right, a video of just people at the park with no narrative cohesion whatsoever. You have extremes in correlations in brain patterns. Now, a lot of what I will be talking about in the second part of my presentation actually comes from Randy Olson, who was a tenured professor and a marine biologist until he decided to quit academia to go to film school to learn how to make films and to become an effective science communicator using films. And I encourage you to find his books and to read more about his thoughts on this topic. And his point is that a lot of science communication is done through what he calls the and framework. And here's one example. Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system, and it's 380 times the mass of the Earth, and it's the fifth planet from the sun, and so forth. You can imagine what the rest of the statements might be like. It reads like a Wikipedia entry, and the story sort of goes on and on without really coming to an obvious point or a conclusion. And the problem with this is that this type of approach might be effective for people who are already interested in astronomy. And Olson calls this your inner circle. But unfortunately, there's also a group of people in your outer circle who outnumber your inner circle, who aren't necessarily interested in your topic, and you really have to convince them to be interested. And Olson finds that who you can learn from are the people who have spent 100 years figuring out how to make billions of dollars in storytelling and in engaging with people, and that's the entertainment industry. And we know that people can only listen to a lecture in a classroom for so long before their mind starts to wander and their attention starts to lag. But people in Hollywood have figured out ways for people to basically binge watch TV shows for a good part of a day or without sleeping, and that they can keep people engaged and keep them coming back. So how do they do it? Well, Olson identified what he calls a and, but, therefore framework as an alternative to the and framework. And here's one example. A young girl lived in Kansas on a farm, and she had a boring life. But one day she was carried away in a tornado, and therefore she has to make her way home. So obviously this is the framework to The Wizard of Oz, and you can come up with similar frameworks, breaking down the story into and, but, and therefore statements with lots of movies, lots of stories that are popular with the public. And the way that these and, but, therefore statements work is the following. The and statements are basically talking about basic facts of agreement. These are things that people can't argue about. There's no tension involved in these basic facts. And the but statements are the ones that add tension, that add conflict, that add contradiction, that have to be resolved. And the resolution comes in through the therefore statements. And so these therefore statements have some consequence. They lead to a natural end to your story. And what Olson recognized was that this ABT framework, and, but, and therefore, shows itself in all sorts of different media. And so, for instance, in political speeches, the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, or Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. If you look at those speeches, they can be broken down into and, but, and therefore parts. And similarly, song lyrics can often be broken into the ABT framework, and even corporate logos and their slogans can be thought of as having evolved through the ABT structure. Yeah, so that brings us to astronomy stories. Astronomy tends to be much more difficult to connect with the public, and that's just because the concepts that we're dealing with are remote, they're abstract, they tend not to have any connection to people's everyday lives, and so simply listing one fact after another separated by ands won't do. So how do we use and, but, and therefore? Here are some examples. So let's talk about the heliocentric solar system. What are some facts that people can agree upon before we can introduce the heliocentric solar system? Well, first, we know that educated people thought that the center of the universe was the Earth, that the heavens were perfect, and that celestial bodies moved in circular motions. But here's the contradiction. As we learn and observe the heavens more accurately, we found that circular motions often became more and more complicated, and so therefore Copernicus proposed a more elegant heliocentric universe. But we know that's not the end of the story, so let's continue our story to Kepler's laws. Again, we can lay out the basic information at the beginning. We know that the sun should be at the center of the universe, and it made sense given our observations of the motions of planets. But again, those motions were hard to define and model given circular motions, and so therefore Kepler came up with the inspired idea of elliptical orbits. We can also talk about the discovery of black holes, how binary systems, star systems were known. Those are simple statements of fact, but there were some systems where one pair of the binary was invisible, and so therefore you can now introduce black holes. Now, I've done a workshop with volunteer docents at my museum on using and, but, and therefore. And here's one example from one of our volunteers, Rich Jartoe, about the speed of light. I don't expect you to look at this carefully unless you frame this. But what's really nice about his story, and this is only the very beginning parts of it, is that the and, but, therefore framework is fractal, so that you can use it to introduce the overall story, but you can also see that subparts of that story can also be put into the ABT format. And then finally, just to show you that pretty much every type of presentation can be done in ABT. The abstract of my talk can be broken out into ABT. And so with this and all these other examples, I encourage you to try using the and, but, and therefore framework yourself in your next presentation. Thank you.